My name is Clara. I've been married to my husband, David, for almost 5 years now, if you count the time we've been together. We've been in a relationship for about 10 years. Even after all this time, David still treats me with the same love and care as he did before. His thoughtfulness is what keeps our relationship strong. I'm lucky to have a good relationship with my mother-in-law, who is also David's mom. We get along well and don't have the typical problems that people talk about between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law. There's no mistreatment, and our family life is peaceful. However, there is one problem: David's older sister, my sister-in-law. She's been the only one who has caused trouble in my life. Even when I was dating David, she and her husband were doing well financially. He had a successful business, and they lived comfortably. I'm so lucky to have such a wonderful husband. We don't need to do much to live well. My sister-in-law and her husband would often say. They had no kids, so they didn't need to worry about things like school fees. They would spend money on expensive dinners and frequent trips abroad. I occasionally heard about their lavish lifestyle, but I never felt jealous or wanted the same. A few years after David and I got married, my sister-in-law's life changed. Her husband's business started to fail, and they faced serious financial problems. They had always lived in a way that showed off their wealth, and now my brother-in-law, who used to always wear designer clothes, looked much older. My sister-in-law, Al, started looking tired and her makeup wasn't as perfect as before. David and I had been living with his parents since we got married. My sister-in-law and her husband would often visit and ask my in-laws for money. I lost my parents when I was young, and my in-laws have always been kind to me, so it hurt me to see them being asked for money all the time. I wanted to help, but there was nothing I could do. David tried talking to his parents about it, but every time my sister-in-law and her husband came, they would insist they needed money and wouldn't leave until they got it. I was fed up with their selfishness. Then, one day, they showed up with a lot of bags. "We're moving in here from now on," they said, and without asking,
they started settling into the house.
They even took our room, claiming it as their own without permission. David and I had a 4-year-old son, and we were both working part-time with the support of my in-laws. We didn't have financial problems and were able to save money and give some to my in-laws for living expenses. At first, I thought, maybe they're really struggling,
so we let them stay.
But that didn't last long. My sister-in-law started asking for more money from my in-laws. "Dad,
I'm in a really tough situation.
Can you give me some money? I'm so stressed. I might collapse." "Mom, please help me," she would say, asking for money every day. Then, she started asking David and me for money too. "David, you're making good money, right? You've been helping your sister for a while, so why not do something nice for her?" she would ask. She even took money from David's wallet without asking.
"Don't complain about just $100 or $200.
"You're being so petty," she would say, laughing. Then, she said to me, "Clara, your parents are gone, right? That means you have an inheritance, right? You haven't spent it all, have you? Lend me some," she said. I couldn't believe how shameless she was. David,
our parents,
and I had no intention of lending them any money, even though my in-laws had helped them before. There was no gratitude at all. It also turned out that before marrying David's brother, my sister-in-law had started her own business. She ignored everyone's advice, but it failed, and she went deep into debt. It was thanks to my in-laws that she avoided bankruptcy, but she never showed any thankfulness and still expected us to help her whenever she needed it. Even when her business was doing well after she married David's brother, she never repaid the money they borrowed. Instead, she and her husband kept asking my in-laws for more and more. It seemed like my husband had finally reached his limit because one day he shouted, "Enough is enough." My sister-in-law, however, just laughed arrogantly and said, "You know how tough things are for us, right? If you're not going to help with money, at least keep quiet." I tried to talk to her, but she ignored me completely. The selfish behavior of my sister-in-law and her husband was wearing us all down, including my in-laws. One day, after finishing my part-time job, I saw several missed calls and messages from my mother-in-law and husband. I was worried and opened the messages to find out that my father-in-law had collapsed and had to be rushed to the hospital. I quickly left to meet them, leaving my son with a friend, but by the time I got there, it was too late. My father-in-law had passed away from a heart attack. I couldn't believe it. My husband, my mother-in-law, and I were all in shock, and I couldn't cry right away. When we got home, my mother-in-law was devastated. She quietly cried as she looked at my father-in-law, who was now gone. My husband tried to reach my sister-in-law, but she said she was busy with her brother's company going bankrupt and refused to come. She also told us to handle the funeral arrangements ourselves. I wasn't surprised by this, but it still hurt. My father-in-law had always done so much for us. I wanted to do whatever I could, but it felt wrong that my sister-in-law was being so selfish. The next day, she and her husband came to ask my mother-in-law about the inheritance. My mother-in-law was exhausted and couldn't respond. Instead, my husband spoke up. "It's not the time for this,"
he said.
But my sister-in-law didn't care. She kept demanding answers about the inheritance. Even though my mother-in-law wasn't responding, my husband and I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. A few days after the funeral, my mother-in-law collapsed from the stress and exhaustion. She had to be hospitalized. I stayed by her side in the hospital, worried about her. I tried to reach my sister-in-law, but she didn't answer. Later, my husband told me something shocking. My sister-in-law and her husband had gone on a trip abroad,
even though my mother-in-law was in the hospital.
When I finally got through to her, she said, "Stress? If it's not an illness, then it's not important. Stop making a big deal out of it." I couldn't believe she said that, especially after all that had happened. It hurt to see my mother-in-law suffering, and I wanted to make my sister-in-law realize how wrong she was. My husband felt the same way. We found out that my sister-in-law and her husband had gone to Las Vegas. They had taken money from my father-in-law's bank account and were planning to gamble at the casino, hoping to win big and save my brother-in-law's failing business. After my husband told me this, my mother-in-law asked me to do something for her. "Can you contact this person for me?" she asked, handing me a piece of paper with the name of a real estate agent. Since my husband was busy, I agreed to handle it. The next day, the agent came to meet my mother-in-law at the hospital. When I visited her again, the agent was already there. My mother-in-law had decided to sell her house. She asked me to pack up everything quietly so my sister-in-law wouldn't notice. My husband and I began preparing to move our things before my sister-in-law and her husband returned. When I told my son about the move, he offered to help. My mother-in-law had wanted to live on her own, but we were worried about her being by herself. So, we suggested she live with us. She was so thankful, and we quickly found a new apartment close to our jobs, just as she had requested. We decided not to tell anyone in our family about the move. We hired a moving company and left my sister-in-law and her husband's belongings behind. While they were enjoying their trip, we successfully relocated. From that point on, my mother-in-law just needed rest, and her health began to improve. She was discharged from the hospital, and we started our new life as a family. 3 days after my mother-in-law came home, my sister-in-law and her husband returned from their trip, only to find their house empty. They had no idea where we had gone, and we made sure no one would tell them. We informed our workplaces about the situation, asking them not to share any information. Thanks to that, our new home remained a secret. "I never want to see them again," my husband said. "I feel the same way," I replied. "And I know my mother-in-law feels the same." My sister-in-law and her husband were the cause of all this trouble. Not only had my father-in-law passed away, but when my mother-in-law became ill, they did nothing to help. My mother-in-law even said, "I don't consider them family anymore." We had already signed a contract for a new apartment, but my mother-in-law offered to use the money from selling her old house to help us build a new home. We gratefully accepted her kind offer. Since then, my mother-in-law has been in great health and takes care of herself, allowing both my husband and me to work without stress and manage our home with ease. Once our new house was built, some time passed, and one evening after our son had fallen asleep, my mother-in-law called us into her room. "I have something to discuss," she said, motioning for us to sit. She handed us an envelope. "What's this?" I asked, curious. "This is something your father asked me to give you if he ever passed away. I've been holding on to it all this time." "I never expected to give it to you so soon," she said with a shy smile. My husband opened the envelope, and inside we found a copy of the will and a document detailing the inheritance. We were shocked to see that my father-in-law had left us a significant amount of money, more than we expected. We were speechless, our eyes wide in disbelief. "I don't think we can accept this much," I said. My mother-in-law chuckled and reassured us, "It's okay, don't worry. Your father wanted this because you are his only children now," she said kindly. It turns out that my father-in-law wrote the will after my sister-in-law and her husband caused so many problems. He was fed up with them and decided that almost all of his inheritance would go to my husband and me. He even wrote that the money he had lent to my sister-in-law would be considered a gift, and he was cutting ties with them. My mother-in-law smiled again and said, "You have children, don't you? You have a future ahead of you. There's nothing wrong with having money. Use it wisely, please." My husband looked at me and said, "It's what our father wanted. Let's accept it gratefully." We thanked my mother-in-law and also expressed our gratitude to my father-in-law. A few days later, we learned that my sister-in-law had been desperately trying to find out where we were. She contacted all our relatives, but none of them knew where we had moved. When she found out, she was furious and blamed my mother-in-law, even saying that she and her husband were getting divorced. However, they still had to deal with the debts they had incurred, and even if they divorced, the debt would remain. I felt no sympathy for them. They had done nothing but take advantage of our help, and now they were facing the consequences. If anything, I thought, that's what they deserve. My sister-in-law, despite receiving help from her parents multiple times, had never shown any gratitude. She even stole money from her brother's wallet without saying thank you, and tried to take my parents' inheritance. I have no intention of helping someone who acts so recklessly. It seems my sister-in-law tried to declare bankruptcy, but it wasn't accepted. In addition to cash advances, she and her husband had borrowed money from loan sharks. As a result, my sister-in-law now has to work tirelessly and can't keep the money she earns. But I won't offer any help. Right now, my mother-in-law's health is the most important thing. If this life brings her happiness, then I'm fine with it. My husband feels the same. We both want to do everything we can to make sure my mother-in-law, who has gone through so much, can enjoy the rest of her life. I agree completely, I replied.